Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Fever of 1721, the Epidemic that Revolutionized Medicine and American Politics, by Stephen Coss, narrated by Bob Souer. Introduction. 1721 might be the most important anonymous year in the evolution of both modern medicine and American liberty. During the worst smallpox epidemic in Boston's history, a lone physician conducted an experiment that saved hundreds of lives, launched a new medical discipline, and helped pave the way for the eradication of the world's most devastating disease. The procedure he employed, known as variolation or inoculation, would, over time, be modified and extended to fight against other fatal diseases, preventing the deaths of untold millions of persons. In 1721, though, it was considered primitive, barbaric, and tantamount to attempted murder. Town officials, the medical establishment, and many rank-and-file Bostonians opposed it. Some of those opponents seemed willing to do anything to stop it. But the smallpox epidemic wasn't the only fever gripping Boston that year. By 1721, the members of the elected Massachusetts Assembly were in the midst of an unprecedented political rebellion against the Crown-appointed governor. Many officials in London were convinced that the Americans were in revolt and determined to wrest their independence from England. The convergence of the inoculation controversy and the political uprising yielded a remarkable byproduct: America's first independent newspaper. Never before had a successful paper dared publish without pledging its allegiance to the government. The New England Courant not only refused to solicit an official blessing, it went out of its way to discomfit the political and religious establishments. Nominally and opportunistically founded to oppose inoculation, it quickly expanded its scope to include a spirited public discussion of political liberty and corruption. Caught up in the political excitement of the day, its publisher argued for political self-determination, a society that valued individual merit over noble birth, and freedom of the press. Even after he was jailed for casting aspersions on the competency and integrity of the most powerful men in Massachusetts, the royal governor included, he pressed ahead, challenging and scandalizing authority and insisting upon the radical notion that the press operated outside the control of the government. In April 1721, smallpox came to Boston for the first time in nearly 2 decades. It arrived aboard the HMS Seahorse, a British warship. By the time the epidemic had burned itself out a year later, approximately half the town's 11,000 inhabitants had been infected. Among those who had escaped death were nearly 300 men, women, and children who had undergone inoculation. The procedure began with an incision in the skin of a healthy person. The incision was then implanted with viscous fluid from the vesicles or pustules of someone broken out in smallpox. The idea was to produce an extremely mild and easily tolerated case of the disease and confer immunity to future infection. Prior to 1721, inoculation was virtually unknown in America and had never been attempted. The proposal to try it in Boston came from an improbable source, the Puritan minister Cotton Mather. Mather, a theological conservative and master of the fire and brimstone Jeremiad, was already one of the most controversial figures in Boston, chiefly as a consequence of his involvement in the Salem witch hysteria nearly 3 decades earlier. Generally regarded as a man prone to superstitions and infatuations, he had become, in the years since Salem, an adherent of Enlightenment science and an enthusiastic monitor of the latest and most exotic medical developments in Europe and beyond. The town's most esteemed physicians dismissed Mather's proposal out of hand, but one doctor, Zabdiel Boylston, accepted his challenge. In 1721, Boylston was 42 years old and successful both as a physician and an apothecary shop owner. He had achieved a measure of fame for his uncommonly good track record with surgeries, but was relegated to the second tier of medical practitioners because he lacked the educational and social pedigrees of many of his colleagues. Without Boylston's daring, James Franklin would never have launched the New England Courant. For nearly 4 years, the struggling Boston printer had been looking for an opportunity to start a newspaper modeled on the best London publications, a weekly that would be witty, literate, provocative, and ambitious, the antithesis of the two generally dull and perfunctory Boston newspapers already in circulation. In 1721 he leveraged the public's hunger for information and opinions about inoculation to put his plan into action. If his Courant had done nothing more than reprint excerpts of Lockean essays on liberty by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, along with the topical Spectator commentaries of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, it would have made a noteworthy contribution to the evolution of both American journalism and American independence. But it went further. Side by side with the essays of the great political and social thinkers of the European Enlightenment, James published distinctively American essays and letters penned by himself and his friends. They presumed to criticize and satirize the religious and political establishments of colonial Massachusetts with a boldness that scandalized their father's generation. The Courant was the Onion, Daily Show, and Colbert Report of its day. Indeed, an argument can be made that American social and political satire began with James Franklin's newspaper, and that everything that followed, from Mark Twain to Will Rogers to Matt Stone's and Trey Parker's South Park, is descended from it. At the same time he was inventing American social and political commentary, James Franklin was also helping invent the man generally regarded as the first American. 2 years after being pulled from school, 12-year-old Benjamin Franklin had been indentured as his older brother's apprentice. For the better part of the next 3 years, as he learned the trade that would make him wealthy, Ben had embarked upon his storied self-education. His inspiration and many of his texts came from his brother's printing house, which contained a large and diverse library of books and periodicals, and served as a meeting place for James Franklin's clever and loquacious friends. Their conversations about books and pamphlets, and debates about politics, religion, and the social issues of the day fired young Benjamin's mind and imagination, and he began to see his destiny unfold before him. Then, in 1721, the 15-year-old was given a front-row seat to the inoculation controversy. What he learned from that debate, and from his involvement in the newspaper that grew out of it, changed his life and helped define him as an author, a publisher, a political philosopher, an experimenter, and a diplomat. In a sense, everything Benjamin Franklin ever really needed to know he learned in 1721. By early 1722, he was ready to take the public stage, disguised as a country widow named Silence Dogood. It's fitting that the political movement that would one day make Benjamin Franklin famous as an American patriot was coming of age at the same time he was. The man behind that first organized push toward American independence was a doctor-turned-businessman-turned-politician named Elisha Cooke, Jr. The son of one of the colony's wealthiest men and most beloved politicians, Cooke the younger had inherited his father's fortune, talent for politics, and bitter and abiding resentment toward England for its 1684 cancellation of the original Massachusetts Charter, which had given the colony a remarkable degree of political autonomy. Shortly after being elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives for the first time in 1716, he had put all 3 of those inheritances to work opposing and obstructing the royal government. Before 3 years had elapsed, the pugnacious, hard-drinking Cooke had built America's first political machine. He had also become the bane of English officials, one of whom accused him of poisoning the minds of his countrymen with his Republican notions in order to assert the independency of New England. In 1721, a smallpox epidemic sparked a profound leap forward in medical science. It also served as a catalyst for the invention of American journalism, the coming of age of Benjamin Franklin, and the beginning of American independence itself. This book is about that epidemic and the political rebellion that accompanied it. It is the story of 5 remarkable men and how their courage, daring, vision, and desperation in a time of crisis defined their destinies and ours. Prologue. On December 11, 1719, a strange light appeared in the Boston night sky. Red waves radiated from the northeast horizon upward into the heavens like the glow of an ethereal fire. Then the light spread itself through the heavens from east to west and streamed with white flashes or streams of light down to the horizon, very bright and very strong. It weakened and disappeared after an hour, only to reappear several hours later in a new and somewhat dreadful form, flame-like at one moment and blood-red the next. One observer, Harvard College's scientific tutor Thomas Roby, admitted to being reminded of descriptions of Judgment Day, but hastened to add that he attached no apocalyptic prognostications to what he had witnessed. "I don't mean that this sight was not surprising to me," he later wrote, "but I only mean that no man should fright himself by supposing that dreadful things will follow, such as famine, sword, or sickness." Although Roby himself had no use for the traditional Puritan interpretation of an unusual celestial phenomenon, which in this case he correctly identified as the aurora borealis, he understood that many of his fellow Bostonians still did. Only 39 years had passed since a bright comet had caused a Boston minister to preach a famous apocalyptic Jeremiad titled "Heaven's Alarm to the World," or a sermon wherein is showed that fearful sights and signs in heaven are the presages of great calamities at hand. The belief that certain events in the skies and on the earth were signs of God's displeasure with the wickedness of the people and a warning that heaven's vengeance was imminent continued to have currency. So did the idea that when bad things happened, they were manifestations of that vengeance. 9 years earlier, when a huge fire had destroyed half of Boston, the same minister who had delivered the earlier comet Jeremiad had preached "Burnings Bewailed" in a sermon in which the sins which provoke the Lord to kindle fires are inquired into. Now there were so many potential catastrophes looming over the town that one did not need to be particularly inclined toward what Roby called ignorance and fancy to suspect that divine vengeance was imminent. On the frontiers of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, the Indians were becoming increasingly provocative and warlike. In the Atlantic and the Caribbean, pirates were running amok, threatening the ocean-going commerce integral to the harbor town's economic survival. And it had become clear that even if Massachusetts never lost another silver coin to a pirate, a commercial system rigged to favor the crown at the expense of the colony might still cause it to run out of money. A pamphlet published soon after the appearance of the strange celestial lights claimed that Massachusetts had lost nearly £1 million of silver and gold since the beginning of the new century. Soon, it warned, there wouldn't be enough currency left to pay debts or taxes, or even to buy food. Arguing that the silver shortage disproportionately harmed the poor and the middle class, a group of up-and-coming businessmen and members of the Massachusetts House of Representatives continually pushed the royal governor to approve large emissions of paper currency. The governor and his wealthy friends, many of whom traded directly with England, and so had plenty of silver at their disposal, pushed back. The cure for the shortage of silver, they insisted, was not to give people more money, but to force them to live with less. Equilibrium would be restored if the poor and middle class stopped living beyond their means and above their station, meaning that they stopped shipping off their silver to England for luxury goods they had no business buying. The friction over the currency question was only one point of contention between the Crown-appointed governor and the popularly elected provincial assembly. Indeed, by late 1719 that relationship had become adversarial on so many fronts that many Bostonians believed England would smite Massachusetts before God did. From the very beginning, or at least since the 1650s, when it had begun ignoring and defying the Navigation Acts, the colony had been a thorn in the paw of the mother country, frequently uncooperative and sometimes unruly and defiant. But now 3 years of unprecedented bickering and fighting had brought the governor and the people of Massachusetts into an attitude of obstinate antagonism to one another. The dispute was approaching a flashpoint. Soon, many feared, England would cancel the new Massachusetts Charter, granted in 1691, depriving the colony of any vestige of self-governance and instituting martial law in its place. A little over a month after the appearance of the Northern Lights, another glow appeared on the horizon. This time it was anything but ethereal. The Boston Harbor Lighthouse was on fire. The blaze had been ignited by hot oil dripping from one of the lamps at the summit of the 50-plus-foot structure. While the people watched helplessly, the fire consumed the lighthouse interior. It might have been worse. No one had been killed or hurt, and the fire had burned itself out before compromising the structural integrity of the exterior. Thanks to a determined effort by the town, Boston Light was repaired and back in operation by late the following month. Still, the temptation to interpret the conflagration as something more than an accident was powerful. The question was whether it was the punishment foretold by the lights in the sky, a manifestation perhaps of God's anger over the rampant and sinful materialism and lust for luxury imports that the town's burgeoning ocean trade had fostered, or a more emphatic and dramatic omen, either of the collapse of Boston's teetering trade-based economy or of some other and even more terrible conflagration still to come. On October 28, 1720, a merchant brigantine commanded by a 38-year-old Bostonian named John Gore entered the outer reaches of Boston Harbor and made its way to the Nantasket Roads, the southern of two deep-water channels that served as nautical highways into and out of the harbor. Gore's ship passed Little Brewster Island, whose lighthouse had been gutted by fire 8 months earlier, and continued inward, gliding past George's Island and Rainsford Island, and then rounding the southern tip of the knife-shaped Long Island before bending to the north. This amounted to the clubhouse turn for returning vessels. Just ahead, the Nantasket Roads joined up with the southward-bending President Roads to begin the final 2-mile stretch to the harbor wharves. Gore was just over 4 miles from completing his nearly 2-month, 3,280-mile voyage from England when he veered off course, tacking sharply north in the direction of a 49-acre island whose odd configuration consisted of 2 low, rounded hills connected by a thin spit of land. From the vantage point of passing ships, the island looked like a pair of pince nez laid flat on the surface of the water. Indeed, passing Spectacle Island was all that most ships ever did. Clear-cut for firewood during the early years of the town, the ungainly island had sat deserted for decades. Then, in 1717, the Massachusetts Assembly had designated it as the site for a public quarantine hospital. The resulting facility, bare bones in every respect and lacking in medical personnel, was better described by its informal name, the Pest House. It was a repository for persons suffering from contagious and deadly distempers, especially smallpox, measles, yellow fever, and, should it ever make the jump from Europe, the plague. In February 1718, the General Court, the name for the Massachusetts legislature, had passed a law requiring ships carrying infectious diseases to anchor near Spectacle Island and to transfer infected persons to the pest house until they died or recovered completely. The water bailiff had authority to order a diseased merchant ship to quarantine there, but inspections were cursory, more concerned with contraband than disease. More often than not, it fell to the captain to self-quarantine. The unpopularity of that decision with shipowners, who paid captains to complete their voyages with all deliberate speed, and with healthy crew members and passengers who, having spent weeks or months at sea, had no appetite for being stopped short within sight of their final destination, made it a challenge for even the most ethical captains. Differentiating between a relatively harmless disease and a deadly one complicated the issue. So did determining whether a contagion that had surfaced early in a long voyage had burned itself out by the time the ship had reached Boston Harbor weeks or months later. That had been John Gore's dilemma. A few days out of Bridgehampton, he had discovered a case of smallpox aboard his ship. Soon a second case emerged, followed rapidly by a third and a fourth. By the time Gore's brig had passed the midpoint of its voyage, 1 man was dead and 6 more were in various stages of illness. Somehow, despite the inadequacy of the medical care and the hardships of passage on a cold, heaving ocean, all of those men had survived and were nearly or completely recovered by the time the ship entered Boston Harbor. Happily, no new cases had broken out, but Gore knew that there was still at least 1 person aboard who remained vulnerable to infection. If that man developed the disease a day or 2 after the ship's arrival, he might trigger another epidemic like the one that had killed hundreds of Bostonians and sickened thousands more in 1702 and 1703. That person was Gore himself. He might have begun to suspect that something was wrong by the time his ship initiated its final approach to the wharf. Sometimes at its onset, smallpox produces an odd malaise, the sense that one's body was out of gear and working improperly. Not certain that he was sick, but unsure that he was well, Gore had erred on the side of caution, setting a trajectory for Spectacle Island. By late that day, a Friday, he had begun to experience the disease's early symptoms, a quickened pulse and steady climb in body temperature. By the middle of the next day, he had intense pain in his head, stomach, and groin. Then came vomiting and chills. When he woke up the following morning, feverless and feeling well save for a slightly sore throat, He must have tried to reassure himself that he had shaken off whatever had brought him low. Within a few hours, though, a mild red rash began to form in his cheeks and forehead. Then his voice went hoarse, and his throat broke out in sores that stung like paper cuts. As his throat swelled, swallowing went from excruciating to nearly impossible. Now the fever was back and climbing, and the rash was growing redder and thicker and spreading to his arms, chest, and back. By Monday, October 31st, his fever was raging, and the rash had metamorphosed into hundreds of discrete, angry pustules. 7 days later, he was dead. He was buried on Spectacle Island on the evening of November 8th without formal ceremony or the presence of his wife of 7 years, who had not been informed that her husband lay mortally ill a few miles offshore. For the rest of November and nearly all of December, the government concealed the fact that a case of smallpox had come as close to Boston as Spectacle Island. Public panic over the possibility that an epidemic was imminent was one concern. A bigger fear, though, was that rumors of smallpox in Boston might be enough to cause trading partners to embargo the port, devastating the town's anemic economy. Both of Boston's newspapers conspired in the cover-up. When, on December 12th, the Boston News-Letter ran a story about a town threatened by an epidemic, it was Marseille, not Boston, and the epidemic was bubonic plague, not smallpox. Government officials continued holding their breaths, waiting for a second case of smallpox to appear on the mainland, until December 26th, nearly 2 months after Gore's vessel had arrived at Spectacle Island. On that day, at the bottom of the left-hand column of the newsletter's back page, a notice datelined, "Boston began. The danger of the smallpox being over at present through the mercy of God, we may now venture to inform the public of the deplorable and general loss we have lately sustained in the death of Captain John Gore of this town." It went on to eulogize Gore for his legacy of honorable service, which had culminated in a final act of heroic selflessness. But many readers fixed on the opening sentence, which confirmed that after more than 18 years without an outbreak of smallpox, Boston had come perilously close to being visited by its most dread disease. Probably by this point few Bostonians were shocked by the news. 6 weeks was a very long time to keep a secret in a peninsular town whose approximately 11,000 inhabitants were concentrated in an area of less than 4 square miles. What the newspapers didn't disseminate, tavern gossip generally did, albeit with all the exaggerations and inaccuracies that accompanied that form of communication. Nor was it difficult to corroborate the rumor that a ship was anchored at Spectacle Island. All it took was climbing to the summit of Beacon Hill, the tallest of Boston's 3 peaks, from which it was possible to overlook all the islands which lie within the bay and descry such ships as are on the seacoast. But it was one thing to suspect smallpox was close by, and another to have the government confirm it. How Bostonians reacted to that admission depended on whether they had experienced the previous smallpox epidemic. For those too young to remember it, there was a thrill not unlike the one felt while viewing the African lion, the first ever in America, on display at the Boston home of Mrs. Martha Adams. Smallpox, too, was a beast, snarling, fierce, deadly, and exotic. Seeing it up close and safely caged was titillating. But for those who had survived the last epidemic, losing loved ones or nearly their own lives, the announcement produced only an uneasy relief. Historically, a new smallpox epidemic arrived approximately every 12 years. Boston was now 6 years overdue for its next visitation. When it finally came, that epidemic might prove as catastrophic and all-encompassing as the ones that had nearly exterminated the Abenaki, the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and the Pawtucket during the 17th century. What they knew for certain was that no cage could hold smallpox indefinitely. Sooner or later, the beast would escape and devour the town. Part 1. Trouble Near. The common people of this province are so perverse that when I remove any person from the council for not behaving himself with duty towards His Majesty or his orders, or for treating me, His Majesty's governor, ill, that he becomes their favorite and is chose a representative. Samuel Shute, Royal Governor of Massachusetts, letter to the Council of Trade and Plantations, London, June 1, 1720. A devil was once an angel, but sin has brought him to be a fallen angel, an angel full of enmity to God and man. Cotton Mather, A Discourse on the Power and Malice of the Devils, in Memorable Providences Relating to Witchcraft and Possessions, 1689. 1. Idol of the Mob. For a few hours on a sunny, crisp morning in October 1716, Royal Governor Samuel Shute's administration looked quite promising, at least from the outside. Salutes fired from the cannon of the town's batteries and the guns of 2 British warships in the harbor alerted Boston of Shute's imminent arrival and brought thousands of people to the waterfront for a glimpse of the first new governor in 14 years. By the time the Lusitania docked at the end of Long Wharf, a line of spectators extended the full 1/3 of a mile length of the wharf and another 1/4 mile up King Street to the Boston townhouse, where the formal welcome and swearing in would be conducted. The man who appeared on deck, waving to his new constituents and acknowledging their cheers, had small, wide-set eyes, a puggish nose, full cheeks, and a capacious double chin that billowed like a sail over the top of his neckcloth. He was plumper and older than the war hero people had heard about, the man who had fought valiantly under Marlborough and been wounded on the battlefield in Flanders. Aside from his military credentials, all average Bostonians knew about the 54-year-old retired colonel was that he had been raised a Puritan. Shute had converted to the Church of England, presumably in the interest of career advancement. But the knowledge that he shared the religious heritage of a majority of Bostonians was a comfort to those who remembered the hostility of an earlier Puritan-hating Anglican governor who had commandeered their meeting-houses for Church of England services and had made an ostentatious show of his celebration of Christmas, a holiday Puritans not only refused to recognize but considered sacrilegious. More than anything, though, what excited the people of Boston about Samuel Shute was that he was not Joseph Dudley, his predecessor. With a new chief executive came new hope for solutions to the colony's challenges, better cooperation between the executive and legislative branches of the colonial government, and more equitable relations with the mother country. But many political insiders were skeptical that Samuel Shute constituted a new start, a change from the status quo. Although they, too, knew little about the man, they had discovered that his appointment had been finagled by friends of Joseph Dudley, who had first bribed the man originally appointed to replace Dudley into relinquishing the position. The mere possibility that Shute was in the pocket of Dudley and his son Paul, the colony's Attorney General, was enough to earn him enemies among his new constituents. Many persons had never forgiven Dudley for his betrayal of Massachusetts nearly 3 decades earlier, when he had served as henchman to the most despotic governor in the colony's history, Edmund Andros. In 1689, the people had risen up and deposed Andros, jailing and eventually deporting him to England along with Dudley and another man, Edward Randolph. 13 years later, the Crown had sent Dudley back to Massachusetts as its governor. Fears that he would revenge himself on his jailers with draconian assaults on individuals and group liberties had proven largely unfounded, but his administration had been both arbitrary enough and corrupt enough to spur 2 unsuccessful attempts to have him recalled. Having survived those, he might have remained governor for the rest of his life had Queen Anne not died prematurely at age 49, and her successor, George Louis, not decided to do as most new monarchs did and replace his predecessor's appointments with men who would be in his debt. On his way out of office, Dudley had given his political opponents 2 final reasons to despise him, tacitly approving the scheme to rig the selection of his replacement, and double-crossing supporters of a plan to alleviate the worsening silver currency shortage by creating a private bank that would emit paper currency. After making those men believe that he would endorse the venture, he had worked secretly behind the scenes to assure its defeat. The bank's supporters were still smarting from that act of duplicity as the carriage carrying the man Dudley's friends had picked to replace him made its way up King Street. In the months prior to Shute's departure for America, Dudley's men had thoroughly indoctrinated him in their anti-private bank philosophy, preparing him to fend off any new attempts to launch the bank or force the government to emit paper currency. But the currency controversy was about to change in ways the new governor was unprepared to handle, evolving from a dry and somewhat tedious argument over monetary policy into a far-reaching debate over class entitlement, freedom of dissent, Americans' liberties as Englishmen, and the colony's right to self-determination, and becoming, as one historian put it, the secret of political alignment for a generation of emerging patriots and loyalists. Chute made 2 stops along the parade.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?